This show is produced by the Harwood Podcast Network.
Hi, I'm Cindy Harris, and we love making this show available to you free of charge. If you'd like to help us keep it that way, make a contribution to our Karma Jar. For more information, visit our website. Today I'm baking a batch of raspberry vanilla muffins. A few months ago I got an email from a viewer in Melbourne, Australia, and Kaushi was writing to tell me about a cafe nearby that has these great raspberry muffins, and could I create something like that? Well, I had them take some photos and send them to me, and this is what I've come up with. Now if you want to follow along on the recipe with me, get your smartphone and scan the QR code here on the screen, and the recipe will come up and you can follow along with me. These raspberry vanilla muffins are just chock full of fruit, have a little bit of sweetness to them, and with that vanilla flavor, they're a really good muffin. I'm going to be using a 12-cup muffin pan, and normally I put paper liners in it, but I just don't feel like it today. So I'm going to take my baking spray and I'm going to spray each of the wells really well, and just a quick spritz over the top, and that way these muffins will pop out really easily. I'm going to set this aside, and I've got a 2-cup measuring cup, and it's important that you use one that's large like this. I'm going to be measuring into it 1 cup of milk. I'm going to be using a 1% milk today, but you can use any kind of milk that you have on hand. And then I have a 1/2 cup of butter that I'm going to cut in half lengthwise twice, and then run my knife through it just so that it makes some small little squares like this. I'm going to be putting the butter here in the milk because I'm going to heat it up in the microwave and melt it. Now if you don't want to use your microwave, you could put the milk and butter in a small saucepan and put it over low heat on your stove. I'm going to pop this in the microwave, and I like to cook it on 30-second bursts because I really just want the butter to melt. I don't want this to bubble over. So 30-second bursts, I'll check it each time, and once the butter's melted, then we'll go on. Now after about 1.5 minutes in the microwave, pretty much all of the butter is melted. There's a few little lumps, but as I touch the measuring cup, the milk is warm, which means it's just going to continue to melt that butter. I don't really need to heat it up anymore. So I'm just going to give this a stir, and I'll set it to the side. And then we'll start measuring out our dry ingredients. So I have a large bowl, and in there I'm going to measure out 2 cups of flour. And then to the flour I'll add 3/4 cup of sugar, 2.5 teaspoons of baking powder. Now remember, the baking powder is the leavening, and that's what's going to make these muffins rise. So if you're baking and you find that the muffins are not rising, it's because your baking powder is old, because this is actually a chemical, and when it reacts with the moisture and the heat, that's what makes it react and puff up. So if you're finding that your muffins and cakes and biscuits are staying flat, it's not the recipe, it's probably that your baking powder has lost its energy and you need to just get a new box of baking powder. And then 1/2 teaspoon of salt. Now I'm going to take my whisk and I'm going to whisk those ingredients together really well, making sure that the sugar and the salt and the baking powder get mixed throughout that flour. You know, when you're making muffins, you don't want to beat the batter once you get the dry ingredients and the wet ingredients together. You don't want to mix it around too much. It can make the muffin tough. So that's why I go to the trouble to whisk it together really well at this point. Now it's time to put our milk and butter in with our flour. Now if you give it a stir at this point, you can see that all of the butter has totally dissolved and the milk has actually cooled down just a little bit, which is really important because we don't want to add really hot ingredients into our flour because we're going to immediately put the eggs in, and if it was too hot it might start cooking the eggs and that would add a weird texture to the muffin that we don't want. I'm going to go ahead and pour this into the dry ingredients. And then with the same measuring cup, I'm going to crack 2 eggs. And with a fork, I'm just going to give those a little mix up. Again, the reason I'm doing that is that way the eggs are partly mixed before I put it into the dry ingredients. If I just plunk the eggs in, then I've got to mix that a little bit longer, and I don't want to do that. So then I'll pour the eggs in. Then I'm going to add 1.5 teaspoons of vanilla. Yesterday I went to a cooking store and I treated myself to a brand new spatula, so I'm going to use that today. Now I'm going to start by just tossing these ingredients together kind of lightly. I just want to sort of mix the wet and the dry ingredients together, but not completely. There, that's looking pretty good. Because now we're going to add the raspberries. Now I'm going to be using frozen raspberries today, and I just took them out of the freezer so they're still nice and hard. If you wanted to use fresh, you absolutely could, but right now the season is kind of passing and the raspberries are getting kind of expensive. But the frozen raspberries work great because these have been frozen the moment they're picked, so they have great flavor. So I'm just going to put in 1.5 cups. Put that into my bowl, and with my spatula I'm going to stir those in. Now if you were using fresh raspberries, you'd want to be super delicate with this because the raspberries are just made up of little cells and they break apart really easily. Again, it's kind of nice to use the frozen for something like this. And again, I just want to toss it together lightly. Now it's time to get our muffins into the wells. Now I'm going to be using my large cookie scoop today because this batter, because we melted the butter, it's a little runnier, and if I put 1 scoop in, that will fill each of my wells nicely. Now you can see this has filled each of the wells up about 3/4 full, so these are going to be really nice sized muffin. But you see I have some drips, and it's important that we take a paper towel and wipe those up because that's not a lot of batter there and it can tend to burn in the oven. Now I've preheated the oven to 400 degrees. Now after about 18 minutes I'll put a toothpick in, and the toothpick looks a little red because it hit a raspberry, but there's no creaminess on it, so these are baked through. I'm going to let these sit in the pan, but just for about 2 minutes. Now the pan is still really hot because it's only been 2 minutes, but I do want to get the muffins out of the pan, so I'm going to take and I'm just going to topple them over, and they should pop right out. And then I'm going to turn them right side up and let them cool until they're at room temperature. The muffins have gotten to room temperature, and in the photograph that Kaushi sent me from Melbourne, what that cafe had done was taken a little bit of powdered sugar, and so I put some in my little strainer, and I'm just going to tap just a light coating on top. And now for a little taste. Look at all that great raspberry all throughout that muffin. Great flavor, a nice sweetness, not overly sweet, and the raspberries are so fresh tasting, and I love that vanilla with it. It's really a good muffin. Now I do want to thank Kaushi for sending in the idea for these delicious muffins, and if you'd like to make them at home, just go to our website, go to the Nothin But Muffin show notes page, and I'll have the recipe there for you. If you do make them, don't forget to send me a photo so I can send you the muffin badge. Make sure to join us on Facebook. That's where I do all my vlogging, and as always, if you have any questions or ideas for me, please send me an email. I'll see you next time.